Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very informative show coming right up. Our special guest today is Johann Hari, and he's here to talk to us about his new book, Lost-Connctions, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. Now, Johann is a New York Times best-selling author. His book, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, has been translated into 15 languages and is currently being adapted into a major Hollywood film and into a nonfiction documentary series. He has one of the most viewed TED Talks of all times, titled Everything You Think You Know About Addiction is Wrong. And over the past 7 years, he's written for some of the world's leading newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Guardian, the Spectator, and Politico, just to name a few. He's appeared on leading TV shows, including HBO's Realtime with Bill Maher, and he's here today to talk to us about his new book, Lost-Connctions. So let's welcome to the show, Johann.
Hey, Marianne, it's great to be with you.
It is such a pleasure and honor to have you here. My goodness, what a profound book. Once I picked it up, I could not put it down.
Oh, thank you so much. It was it was a kind of very challenging journey writing the book, so I'm really thrilled that people are reacting that way. Thank you.
Well, and so I know you explain about it in your book, but I'd love for you to share with our listeners what even started you on this path of, looking to see why we, have issues with depression and anxiety and those kind of things.
Yeah, there were these two mysteries that were really hanging over me and haunting me. And to be honest, I really put off investigating them for a long time. It's a sign of how nervous I was to look into this that I found it easier to go off and write a book where I spent a load of time with hitmen for the Mexican drug cartels than I did to research this subject. And so there were these two mysteries. One was, why was I still depressed? When I was a teenager, I had gone to my doctor and I had explained that I had this feeling like pain was kind of leaking out of me and I didn't know how to control it. And my doctor told me a story that lots of your listeners will have been told. It's a story people were being told all over the world in the 90s and are still being told today. He said, there's this chemical called serotonin. It makes people feel good. Some people are naturally lacking it in their brains. You're clearly one of them. Take these drugs and you're going to feel better. So I started taking the drugs and I did feel better for a few months, and then this sense of pain started to bleed back through. So I went back to the doctor. He said, clearly I haven't given you a big enough dose. Gave me a high dose. I did feel a little bit better for a time. Then it came back and I was basically in this pattern where I ended up just taking the maximum dose you're legally allowed to take, and then I took it for 13 years. And so what I wanted to know was, at the end of all that, I was still depressed, even though I was doing everything I'd been told to do. And I wanted to know why. And the second mystery was, why were there so many other people like me? When I was a kid, we'd had some members of my family who took some psychiatric meds in the morning, and I was aware that they were very unusual. But a funny thing happened as I got older, which is the whole of Western civilization caught up with my family. Today, 1 in 5 Americans is taking a psychiatric drug at any given time. 1 in 3 middle-aged women is taking an antidepressant to get through the day. Even if you're not taking them, there's so many of us that are taking them and urinating them out that it's in the water supply. So we are literally awash in these drugs. And I want to know, well, why has there been this crisis of depression and anxiety? What's going on? And it was becoming increasingly clear to me, it couldn't just be that we were all suddenly spontaneously lacking some chemical in our brains. There must be something deeper going on. So I ended up going on this big journey over 40,000 miles across the world, from San Francisco to Sydney to Sao Paulo. And I wanted to sit with, firstly, the leading scientists in the world who've been investigating what causes depression and anxiety and how to solve them. And also just people who had radically different perspectives, from an Amish village in Indiana where they had very low depression, to a city in Brazil that had banned advertising to see if it would make people less depressed, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people psychedelic drugs to see if it would make them feel better. And I think the main thing I learned is that the story we've been told about depression, that it's all in our heads. Up until I went to my doctor when I was a teenager, I thought depression was all in my head, meaning, it's imaginary, you're just weak. And then for the next 13 years, I thought it was all in my head, meaning it's some kind of chemical defect in my brain. What I learned is the causes of depression and anxiety are not in our heads. They are largely, not entirely, but mainly in the way we're living now, and in 7 key factors in the way we're living now. And when we understand what's really causing depression, that opens up a very different way of thinking about how we solve it.
And it's so interesting because depression, anxiety, these touch just about everybody we know, and you talk about that too. And it's interesting because doctors are telling people, it's a chemical imbalance. And, it's interesting to find out that there may be alternatives to that might not be the end game.
Well, it's incredible to me to discover. It's incredible to me to discover that these are not like marginal. The debunking of this isn't coming from marginal figures. Mm-hmm. This is the World Health Organization. This is the United Nations explaining there is no evidence there is a chemical imbalance in depressed and anxious people's brains. And this is partly this approach that we've taken based on that has led to very poor results. So I thought I was really weird for taking chemical antidepressants and still being really depressed. Actually, when I looked at the evidence, not the kind of propaganda put out by Big Pharma, but the actual scientific evidence, it's very clear. Between 65 and 80% of people taking chemical antidepressants are depressed again within a year. Now, it's important to say that's not 100%. There's no value in these drugs. Nothing should be taken off the menu. Mm-hmm. But the vast majority of people, we're being offered one thing on the menu, and that thing is not working for us. And I think that's really important because it's based on this flawed theory. And it was shocking to go and talk to all these leading scientists. I mean, Dr. David Healy, who's one of the leading experts in Britain, explained you can't even say the story about serotonin was discredited because it was never really credited. There was never a time when you had half the scientists in the field who believed that. It was basically a story that was promoted by the drug companies because it's a good story, right? It's easy to understand and it makes you want to, buy their drug.
Get the happy pill, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, people talk about that. I just found it to be astounding because, in the research that you did, you talk about different reports, and one Gallup report where people were talking about how disengaged they felt at work. And it was just astounding. It was like 63% of the people felt that they were not engaged at work and felt like they were sleepwalking. And, and I think it was like 23% of that said that they were completely unhappy, completely unhappy. And so all this stuff is so interrelated. It's astounding when we look at those numbers.
Well, this is a thing that, so as I spoke to all these different scientists, explaining this different way of thinking about why we have such a big depression and anxiety crisis, I began to see there was something that connected all the different ways they were thinking. We all know that human beings have natural physical needs, right? Everyone listening to this needs food and water and shelter and all of those things. There's equally strong evidence that we have innate psychological needs. There are things that you need as a human being just to be happy psychologically, to be healthy psychologically. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel you have meaning and purpose. You need to feel people see you and value you. You need to feel you have a secure future. There's a whole range of things that we naturally need as human beings. And there's all this evidence that our culture, which is very good at lots of things, and, I'm glad to be alive today, is getting less and less good at meeting these deep psychological needs that we have. And this is the main, not the only, but the main reason why we have this growing crisis. So you point to one of the examples, which I think is really striking. So I was very aware that lots of the people I knew who have depression and anxiety problems, their depression and their anxiety often focuses on their work. So I started to look at, is there any evidence around depression and work? So you mentioned that Gallup, which is one of the world's leading opinion poll companies, did this really interesting research, actually slightly worse than you said. Yeah. It basically studied how do people feel about their work. And what it found is 13% of us really like our work. We look forward to it most of the time. We get energy from it. 63% are what they called sleepwalking through the day. They don't like it. They don't hate it. They're kind of enduring it. And 24% hate their work. It drains them. It makes them feel terrible. They don't want to go, right? Mm-hmm. So think about that. 87% of people don't like the thing they're doing most of the time. And I began to think, and almost twice as many people hate their work as love their work. And I started to think, well, could there be some connection between this and this crisis we're having? And I discovered there was a man who'd really figured this out. He's an Australian social scientist called Michael Marmot, and he'd done this really interesting research in the 70s. So he actually came at this from a right angle. He stumbled onto this discovery. What he initially wanted to look at was who in an organization is most likely to have a stress-related heart attack. Is it the big boss at the top? Is it the guy in the middle? Is it someone at the bottom of the company? And when he started to do this research, people said to him, look, Michael, this is a total waste of time. Obviously, the guy at the top is going to be most likely to have a heart attack, right? Mm-hmm. So he did this very detailed study. And what he found of an organization that had 19 levels, right, from the guy at the top down to people at the bottom. And what he found was the exact opposite of what people expected. The lower down you went, the more likely you were to have a stress-related heart attack. But that's when he discovered this thing that's important for our conversation, which he also found the same thing was true of depression. The lower down you went, the more likely you were to become depressed. And he thought, well, what's going on here? And that's when he began to study people who worked at the same level, so say the 13th level, to say, well, what are the variations, what are the differences? And that's when he discovered the key of what causes depression at work. You are far more likely to become depressed if you have no control over your work. If you feel that you have no agency, human beings have an innate need to feel that what we do has meaning. And if you feel that you can't create any meaning out of what you're doing, you're just like a robot on a processing line, you are much more likely to become depressed and anxious. And that leads us, this is one of the 9 causes of depression and anxiety that I looked at. And that suggests a very different set of solutions, because I then went and looked at, well, how can we solve that, right? Because there are some jobs that aren't going to be so nice, they have to be done. Got to know, there's a woman called Meredith Keogh. She did an office job in Baltimore, and she used to go to bed every Sunday night just with this sickening feeling of anxiety about the week ahead. And it's not that she had the worst job in the world. She wasn't being bullied. She wasn't, being tormented at work. She just couldn't bear the thought this was going to be the rest of her life. She was in her 20s. She just saw 40 years of this stretching ahead of her. And with her husband, Josh, they decided to do this quite bold thing. Josh had worked in bike stores since he was a teenager. And, as people will know, working in a bike store, you're obviously controlled by your boss. There's not, it's pretty insecure work. There's not a lot of autonomy or a lot of benefits. And it's pretty low paid. Josh and his friends one day in this bike store had this thought, which was just like, what does the boss actually do? They liked their boss, but they realized, well, we fix all the bikes, right? So they decided they were going to set up a bike store themselves, but run on a different principle. They weren't going to have a boss. They were going to have what they called a democratic cooperative. So the way it works is they make all the big decisions together. They share out the good tasks and the bad tasks. They share the profits. And one of the things that was so fun, it's called Baltimore Bicycle Works. When I went there, it's a thriving business. And when I went there, one of the things that fascinated me was most of the people there talked about how when they'd worked in this old way, they'd had these problems with depression and anxiety, and how quickly those problems went away when they were in an environment where they controlled it together, where they had a sense of autonomy and meaning. And again, it's important to understand, it's not like they quit their jobs fixing bikes to go and, be surf instructors in the Florida Keys, right? Mm-hmm. Before they fix bikes now. The difference is what they had done is they had stripped out that aspect of work that causes depression, which is the lack of control. And, as Josh explained to me, there's no reason why any business should be run in this depressing way, right? We could run all businesses in this democratic way if we want. Imagine how much less depressing anyone listening to this, their work would be if they knew that tomorrow they were going into a workplace that they controlled together with their colleagues, where the boss was accountable to them instead of the other way around, instead of only the other way around. That's a very different psychology about the thing where we spend most of our time. But that is an antidepressant, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a chemical antidepressant, but that's an antidepressant. It's something that's proven to reduce depression and anxiety.
It's just astounding how, just the structure of our businesses are in such a way that causes, further depression, anxiety in people, as opposed to, because I know there's a big outreach right now to, with different corporations, like with Google and some of these other larger corporations, Apple, what have you, and they're looking for ways to make the working experience a more, enjoyable for their employees. And it's some of the basic things that they have not even considered, and your book raises so many points. I mean, my goodness, it was so well researched. What were and so when you were doing this, what were some of the surprising things that you came across that also contribute to depression?
There were so many, one of the things, this is going to sound like a strange thing to say, but one of the things that really helped me to think about these causes differently, and I'll come back to some of the causes in a minute, but it was something a South African psychiatrist called Derek Sommerfeld told me. He was in Cambodia in the early part of this century when chemical antidepressants were first introduced in Cambodia. And he was talking to these Cambodian doctors who hadn't heard of them. And he was explaining what they were, what depression is and what antidepressants are. And they said, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he said, what do you mean? And he thought they were going to talk about some, herbal remedy like St. John's wort or something. And they said, oh, well, we'll tell you a story that illustrates it. They told him about a farmer who'd worked in the rice fields there. And one day he'd stood on a landmine that was left behind by the American War, and his leg was blown off, and they had given him an artificial limb, and he went back to working in the fields. But it's very painful to work in water for when you've got an artificial limb, and I'm guessing he was pretty traumatized because he's in the field where he got blown up, and he just started crying all day and didn't want to get out of bed. And they said to Derek, well, that's depression, isn't it? And he said, yeah. And they said, right, we gave him an antidepressant. And he said, what was it? And they said, well, we went and we sat with him, and we listened to his problem, and we realized, well, it's because he's in this field, he's in pain, he's traumatized. And we figured if we bought him a cow, he could become a dairy farmer, and they wouldn't have to work in this field anymore, and he'd be happier. So we bought him a cow, and after a few weeks, he stopped crying, and now he's quite happy. So you see, doctor, that cow was an antidepressant. And if you've been trained in the way we've been taught to think, which so disconnects us from the source of our pain, which tells us the source of our pain is solely in our skull, that sounds like a joke, right? It sounds stupid. Yeah. But when you understand that depression and anxiety are largely responses to problems in life, it makes perfect sense. What depressed and anxious people need, now there are biological factors that can make it worse, but what depressed and anxious people need is for us to start solving the causes of their depression and anxiety. And so that when you understand that different way of thinking, so for example, one of the 9 causes of depression and anxiety that I talk about in Lost Connections, one of them is our profound disconnection from each other. So we are the loneliest society there has ever been. There's an incredible study of Americans that asks the average American, how many close friends do you have you could call on in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none. There are more Americans who have nobody they could turn to in a crisis than any other option. And human beings, the reason we are having this conversation, the reason we're able to have this conversation is because our ancestors, our distant ancestors, were really good at one thing. They were really good at cooperating in tightly knit tribes. Human beings were not faster or stronger than the animals that we were able to take down. What we were was better able at cooperating. So every human instinct we have is geared towards living in a tightly knit, highly cooperative tribal group. And we are the first humans ever to try to live without a tribal group. And if you think about the circumstances in which humans evolved, if you were separated from the tribe, you were going to be very anxious and very unhappy for a very good reason. You were in terrible danger, right? You were probably going to die. Mm-hmm. Now, every instinct we have is to make us feel bad when we are lonely and isolated. And we've created this culture of really deep isolation and loneliness. And again, that opens the path to, and there's so much evidence for this. I mean, the extraordinary man I got to know, Professor John Cacioppo in Chicago University, he's done all this research that shows, being acutely lonely is as stressful to a human being as being punched in the face by a stranger. Every aspect of your physical and mental health deteriorates rapidly if you feel lonely. You are flooded with a sense of stress and anxiety. And again, that opens up a different set of solutions, and a different kind of antidepressant. So here in London, I spend a lot of my time in the US, but I'm obviously British. Here in London, there was a really interesting experiment with this. It was a doctor's surgery in a place called Bromley by Bow in East London, where the doctor there, Sam Everington, was really uncomfortable because he had lots of people coming to him, lots of patients coming to him, talking about being depressed and anxious. And he would listen to their lives and he would think, well, it's totally understandable why you're depressed and anxious. You're depressed and anxious for completely understandable reasons. But he had been taught at med school that what you were meant to do is tell people, well, you've got a chemical imbalance in your brain and you need to drug yourself. It's not that Sam is opposed to chemical antidepressants. He's not. He thinks they have a role. But he just thought this is way too limited a way of thinking about this. So he pioneered a different approach. So when a patient called Lisa Cunningham came to him, she had been shut away in her home for 7 years with really acute depression and anxiety. She came to him and he said, look, I'll give you these chemical antidepressants if you want, but I'm also going to prescribe for you to take part in a group. And he gave her a choice of groups, but the group she chose was a gardening group. There was a patch of scrubland near the doctor's surgery. And a group of depressed people were asked, will you guys just meet a couple of times a week and turn this scrubland into something beautiful? So they were very skeptical at first. They got together, this group of depressed people, many of whom had just barely spoken to anyone in a long time, and they started learning about gardening. They started experimenting with the soil. And it was interesting because it gave them a place where they could talk about the depression and anxiety, where they could talk without having to talk about the depression and anxiety, where they could talk about something else. And the way, and I spoke to many people who've taken part in this program, and the way Lisa described it is, as they started to get their fingers in the soil, as they started to talk to each other, as they started to connect both with nature and with each other, the garden began to bloom and they began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a similar program that found it was twice as effective as chemical antidepressants because it's dealing with the real cause, that they were isolated, they'd become cut off. And again, another aspect of this that I think is so important is disconnection from the natural world is a big driver of depression. There was a really fascinating study that looked at, there was the state prison in Michigan, happened just by, no one designed it this way, just by chance. One part of the prison looked out over kind of beautiful greenery, and one part of the prison just looked out over concrete. And there was a study there that found that the people who looked out over concrete were 23% more likely to develop mental illnesses than the people who looked out over greenery. This is our habitat. This is what we evolved to live in, green space. And the fact that so many people are cut off from that is itself driving up depression. And these programs of reconnection, all these different kinds of antidepressants share something. They're about reconnecting with things that we deeply need, that are part of our human nature, that our society has, we've built a society that either neglects or actively attacks.
mean, you look at today's culture, and we've got so many people attached to some type of device that they're really disconnected from one another. And it just kind of feeds into, you know, feeling that loneliness and that disconnection.
Well, one of the things that really interested me is I went to the first ever rehab center for people with internet addictions in the United States. It's a place called Restart Washington in Washington State. And actually, I have to admit, the first thing that I arrived there, it's this clearing in the woods. And the first thing I did is look at my phone, see I had no signal, and feel really irritated. I was like, oh, okay, you've missed the point, right? So it was really interesting talking to the people there, and particularly Hilary Cash is the doctor who runs it, who's become really an expert on this. Just by coincidence, she happened to be a psychotherapist next to the Microsoft offices in the 90s. So she kind of became an early wave expert on this. Mm-hmm. And what she explained to me, which about this obsession we have with our devices, the average American checks their phone every 6.5 minutes, and 42% of Americans never switch their phone off. Never.
Wow.
And it was very interesting talking to her about this, because I think this internet addiction is a symptom of this crisis we're talking about. It's a symptom that makes the problem worse, but it's a symptom. Because if you look at what happens, so a lot of the young men who go to this rehab center are obsessed with these multiplayer games like World of Warcraft. Mm-hmm. And Hilary said to me, and a lot of the young men there said to me, you know, what do they get out of these multiplayer games? They get a sense of a group that they belong to. They get a sense of status. They get a sense there's something they're good at, that they can get better at and improve at. These are all things that increasingly we have lost in our culture, right? There was a study in Britain that found the average British child spends less time outdoors than the average maximum security prisoner, because by law, a maximum security prisoner has to have an hour and 10 minutes a day, and most British kids don't get that. For American kids, it's even worse. So we've imprisoned our children. We've cut them off from these things that they need, and this of course is playing out with adults as well. So if you look at the moment when the internet arrives in the late 90s, for most of us in the late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of these things have already collapsed. So there's already been a collapse in social connections. There's already been a collapse in meaningful values, which we can talk about if you like, that we've become obsessed with junk, with buying things. We think that's what life's about, and there's a lot of evidence that that's causing a lot of depression and anxiety as well. And then the internet arrives, and what the internet gives us is it looks like the thing we've lost. And it's similar enough to meet a basic kind of itch. It's a bit like if you give pornography to a sex-starved person. It's similar enough that it's going to meet a kind of basic itch, but it's not going to give you a sense of deep satisfaction. It's not going to give you a sense of being held and valued. So we end up with like status updates in place of status, with Facebook friends in place of actual friends. And so you end up with this kind of parody of connection, which we turn to because we've lost these more meaningful things. Now, I'm not saying Facebook should be, even if we could, I wouldn't want to get rid of Facebook or Twitter or those things. But it's become we've had to develop such an unbalanced relationship with it because the other connections that we need aren't there.
I would agree with you wholly. I mean, when it comes to social media, I look at some of it, and it's been great because it's allowed me to connect with people that I haven't seen in like 25 years, And so what a joy that is. And at the same time, you can feel where, you're doing some of the connecting and just reaching out with people. And sometimes that could be a little bit of a drain as well if you're not having what you talk about is that balance. And that's so important because I think that's what has kind of been missed.
Yeah, Professor John Cacioppo, who did this, is basically the leading expert on loneliness in the world, says social media is a good thing if it's a way station to meeting people offline. If it's your final destination, then there's a problem. And, one of the things that this connects to is this really fascinating research. It was very challenging to me about the Amish, where I spent some time with the Amish. The Amish have incredibly low levels of depression. And this can be measured in all sorts of ways. And, partly it's because they're not using these devices, and partly it's just, and there's a lot wrong with the Amish, don't get me wrong, but it's partly that they know they understand something intuitively that we have not understood, which is what really matters in life is deep human connection. And, as Lauren Beachy, who's one of the members of the Amish I got to know, said to me, if I lived what they call an English life, which is, the life of non-Amish people, sure, I could drive places, I could watch TV, but the cost of that is that I would spend less time with the people I love, and I would be less happy. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because one of the other things that I'm thinking about as you say that, Marianne, is this other thing I found very challenging. So this thing was discovered in the 70s about depression, this inconvenient thing that was really has really been swept under the rug. So in the 70s, American psychiatrists decided they have this thing called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is like the DSM, which is like their Bible. It's the guide for all psychiatrists about how to diagnose all sorts of problems. And for the first time, they decided to describe the symptoms of depression. So they laid out 10 symptoms of depression, which are pretty obvious things like persistent low mood, feeling worthless. And it says, if your patient feels more than 5 of these symptoms for more than a few weeks, they should be diagnosed as mentally ill, as depressed, and given the appropriate treatment. So they send out this list, and psychiatrists all over the United States start using it to diagnose people. But after a while, they came back and they said, look, there's a bit of a problem here. Using these guidelines, we should be classing every grieving person as mentally ill, because all grieving people show these symptoms for more than a few weeks, right? Mm-hmm. And so there was this debate among psychiatrists, and they said, okay, clearly we need to adjust this. So what they did is they invented this thing called the grief exception, where they said, okay, diagnose people as depressed if they show these symptoms, unless they've lost someone they love in the past year, in which case it's a normal response and you shouldn't diagnose them, right? So again, psychiatrists started using that guideline. But, as the years went on, a lot of psychiatrists became quite uncomfortable because they said, well, wait a minute. We're being told on the one hand that depression is just a brain disease that we should identify with a checklist. And on the other hand, we're being told, well, there's one situation in life where you can show all these symptoms, but it's not a brain disease and we shouldn't use the checklist. Well, why is if someone dies, why is that the only piece of context that should count when you encounter a depressed patient? What about if you've lost your job? What about if you've lost your house? What about if you're stuck in a job for the next 40 years that you hate? Why doesn't that count when someone you love dying counts? But the problem is, if you start to ask that question, then you have to allow in the actual evidence of a person's life. And that is not what they wanted to do in this psychiatric model. What they wanted was a checklist based on a brain disease. So their response to these questions and this challenging was to, over time, reduce the grief exception until eventually, in the latest version of the DSM that came out 2 years ago, they've just got rid of it. It's gone. So now, God forbid, if your child, is born at 10, if your child dies at 10 a.m. and 10:01 a.m. you're showing all these signs of distress, you can be told you're mentally ill and drugged. And that, by the way, is happening to huge numbers of grieving people across the United States. They're being immediately given antidepressants and even antipsychotics. And I think we can all see there's something wrong with that. Because what it does, there's a wonderful person, a doctor called Johann Hari, who lost her daughter Cheyenne, died tragically in childbirth. And she became an expert in treating people with traumatic grief. And she said to me, the fact that psychiatry, and there are lots of good psychiatrists, but the fact that the official bodies of psychiatry can be saying that we should be disregarding context when it comes to depression, that we should be drugging grieving people, it shows how deeply as a culture we just don't get human suffering. If you think suffering is something that happens in the brain unconnected from people's lives, then you've really missed why there's been this huge increase in depression and anxiety, and it helps to explain why that approach has not worked. We've been following that approach for 30 years, and every year we follow it, there's more depression and more anxiety. It doesn't work. We need to re-engage with the real reasons why people are depressed and anxious, which are perfectly understandable. If you're listening to this and you're depressed and anxious, you are not crazy. You're not a machine with a broken part. You're a human being with unmet needs. And that's a very different way of thinking about it. And I think it's actually quite empowering to depressed people, because it makes you realize that we've got to change our culture together. It doesn't just leave it to the depressed person as if there's some defect in them. There's a wonderful Indian philosopher called Krishnamurti who said, it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society. Something's gone wrong with our culture, right? And these things that are manifesting, depression, anxiety, addiction, and I don't mean this as a joke, President Trump, these are symptoms of a really deep crisis in our culture. And I don't disrespect or mock Trump supporters. They're sending a signal of distress that we should certainly be listening to and not mocking or condescending. We need to understand what's going on, and it's that we've built a society that does many things very well, but does not accord with basic aspects of our human nature that we need.
Well, and I think your book and this discussion really is turning things around for people to look at depression and, and anxiety in a different way. Because before, you're so right. I mean, it's kind of like if you're feeling depressed, you are a damaged person, and it offers so much hope to people when to find out that that's so far from the truth.
And I want to stress there are real biological factors that I talk about in the book that can make you more vulnerable to these problems, but they don't cause it. So, for example, the way we know there is a genetic predisposition to depression in some people that makes you more vulnerable to it. The way we know that is if you want to know something's genetic, you compare identical twins and non-identical twins, because obviously identical twins are more genetically similar than non-identical twins. If something is more common in identical twins than non-identical twins, you can figure out how much of it is genetic. And about between 30 and 40% of any individual's vulnerability to depression is genetics. What that means is, if you become lonely, if you get trapped in meaningless work, if the other factors that I talk about in the book play out in your life, and you have this genetic propensity, you will be more vulnerable to it happening. It doesn't cause it alone. So there was a big study, the best study of the genetics of depression that we have was carried out by a guy called Absalom Caspi in New Zealand, where he identified a particular gene that does correlate with depression, but it only kicks in if you become acutely lonely, or if you go through some traumatic event. So if you don't and you carry that gene, you're no more likely to become depressed than anyone else. So what the biological factors do is increase your vulnerability. They don't cause it. And I think that's really important for people to understand, because up to now, when we've only been told these I think there's a lot wrong with the biological story, exclusively biological story. The biggest thing wrong with it is it's just not true. But the second thing is, if you're told, as I was for many, it's incredible to me when I think about it now. I was given antidepressants, powerful drugs, for 13 years, which caused really powerful side effects for me, made me put on a huge amount of weight, for example. And at no point in those 13 years did any doctor ever say to me, hey, Johann, Is there any reason why you might be unhappy? Has anything happened in your life that might be making you unhappy? That was never even brought up, and so I think, how do I put it? We need that story, an exclusively biological story. First, it tells you you're broken and you're just left with being broken and you're going to have to drug yourself for the rest of your life. And secondly, it cuts you off from the quest to find what has actually caused this pain. And it's only when you find the causes of the pain that together we can change it. Now, some of these things we can do as individuals, and I go through 7 different kinds of antidepressant in the book. Some of them we can do as individuals. Some of them require bigger changes because this is a really big crisis. But we can't do anything if we don't know what's really going on.
You're so right about that. At least having the discussion is a start for changing things and moving things in a completely different direction. And my goodness, Johann, I mean, we could talk about this for hours, and we are going to do that in a couple months. I cannot wait to have our next discussion, but we're at the end of our time at the moment. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
Great. So there's the book has a website. It's www.lost-connctions.com. If you go there, you can take a quiz to find out how much you know about the real causes of depression and anxiety. You can listen to audio of interviews with lots of the people I've been talking about. The book has a Facebook page, which is where you can contact me. It's www.facebook.com/thelostconnctions. This book is also available as an audiobook from audible.com. You can follow me on Twitter. It's JOHANN HARI101. The only one I don't have, I got asked at the end of an interview recently, what's your Snapchat? And I said, I'm a 38-year-old man. I'm not. I draw the line somewhere, right?
Well, you are on Instagram because I'm following you there. So,
yeah, on Instagram as well. It's JOHANN.HARI for Instagram.
And I know in a few days you're actually going to be in New York. You've got an event in New York City, and then you're going to be in Washington, D.C., and then Baltimore. So, we have the opportunity to attend one of your book signings and, of course, pick up copies and meet you in person.
Great. There's details of that at the website as well. Yeah, thank you for reminding me.
Well, Johann, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, what a pleasure. Thanks so much, Marianne. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. We are going to pause here for a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 123 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
Do you know that you can become a genius at any age? Do you know that you can change your life and create a brilliant life for yourself? Hi, I am Olympia LaPointe, an award-winning rocket scientist who you more than likely have seen on TED Talks, Impact Theory, and PBS. Check out my latest book, Answers Unleashed, The Science of Unleashing Your Brain's Power. Simply go to answersunleashed.com books and check it out for yourself. You'll find the tools to help you create the life you've always wanted.
The highly acclaimed and newly released book, The Hand Part 2 by Lynn Van Praag Grattan, describes the journey between a psychic medium and a family who lost a son. Messages from Beyond Eternity's Gate is of love and healing. For more information, visit www.linvanprague-grattan.com. That's www.linvanprague-grattan.com.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted to be introducing our next guest, Dr. Bryan Robinson, and he's here to talk to us about his new book, Daily Writing Resilience. Now, Dr. Robinson is the author of 35 nonfiction books and 2 novels. His books have been translated into 13 languages, and he's been featured on 2020, Good Morning America, ABC's World News Tonight, NBC's Nightly News, and many other shows. So let's welcome to the show Dr. Bryan.
Thank you, Marianne. It's great to be here.
It is such a pleasure to have you here, and what a great book to start the new year off with.
I agree. It's a book that I think we can all learn from, and I even, as a writer, keep going back to it myself. And I think, did I write this? Because it's the kind of thing that, it's universal for all of us, whether we're writers or just learning to live life in a positive way.
Yeah, I can agree with you more on that. It has such great inspiration, and even though I know initially it's intended for the writers, but you're so right. I mean, you could just pick it up for instant, inspiration as you go.
Right. There are things in the book like curb your perfectionism and how to deal with self-doubt and rejection, and who among us, whether we're writers or not, hadn't had to deal with those things once in a while, but writers especially. The career of writing has rejection and defeat baked into it, and really the theme in the book is resilience, and how do we keep picking ourselves up and brushing ourselves off and keep going, and some of us do and some of us don't, and I think there's a difference in the ones of us who do and the ones who are not able to continue staying on the path.
Yeah,
it breaks my heart to see people, and I have a friend who's such a good writer and kind of gave up and just started self-publishing, and there's nothing wrong with self-publishing, but his writing is such good quality, in my opinion. It could be with one of the big 5 publishers, but he said, I just got so tired of trying to find an agent, and I just got tired of the rejection. But that's part of the deal, and I've certainly had my share, and any writer I know, one of the things we have to remember is that it's a package deal, rejection and success, and if we want the writing success, we have to accept the rejection, but it's not a personal thing. It doesn't mean that we're not good writers. It just means that we haven't gotten maybe to the place that it's publishable yet, but that can keep us going if we have a mindset and we look at it that way. Like, what can I learn from this situation, and how can I turn it around and make it work for me? That's what makes us resilient. And Marianne, the thing that I learned, I was a coordinator for international thriller writers for the new authors coming in, and I was amazed at how many of the new authors were so nervous and tentative about the next book, and will I be able to do it? So for some of us, this self-doubt follows us through our careers, and for some of the greatest writers out there have had, like a good example of Stephen King. He in his book, he talks about he had a nail for all of his rejection slips, and finally the rejections became so thick he had to replace the nail with a spike. And I think that's a great metaphor for really great writers, is they've all gone through this path of rejection and defeat. But that doesn't mean it's over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of times when people get that rejection, you're so right, they think that, they don't like my writing, as opposed to that's unfit for what they're doing at the moment.
That's right. Could be so many reasons for it, that they have something similar, or it just doesn't fit their line, or And sometimes it could mean we just need to maybe refine our writing a little bit more, which we can learn from that. It is a process, and I've been writing for 40 years, and I've written so many different kinds of things, books and magazine articles and journal articles and blogs and fiction and nonfiction. I've written 2 novels and many, many self-help books. And so I've had my share of rejection. And there's so much out there. The way I came to this is there's so much out there on craft, which is great, but there's hardly anything on how do we stay in the game? How do we develop a winning frame of mind? How do we keep going? And that's really what led me to do this daily meditation book, just one day at a time, how we can keep our mindset, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important things we can have as writers. And a lot of literary agents will say, even more than good writing, a growth mindset or a resilient mindset is the most important thing you can have.
Well, without a doubt, because you have to develop a little bit of a tough skin for, especially, because this is another form of art when we put ourselves out there and we're sharing with the world what it is that we do. You have to have a little bit of a tough skin because you're going to get people who love it and people who don't, and it's okay,
That's right. There's always going to be somebody, it's not their cup of tea, but that doesn't mean that our work is not valid. The other thing that I was going to mention, I'm also a psychotherapist, and so I keep up with a lot of the latest research in psychology and neuroscience. And the other thing that I became aware of as I started to write this book is that scientists tell us that we're all wired with something called a negativity bias. And what that means is that we overestimate threats and we underestimate our ability to handle them. Now, a threat could be our ability to give a speech, our ability to write a book, our ability to get a book published, our ability to be in a healthy relationship, our ability to make enough money to survive. So it can be any kind of threat. But with writers, the threats that are endemic are the ability to succeed. So often that needle falls on the negativity side. And when we know that, then we can turn that around. And one of the readings in the book is about overestimating our ability to handle all the roadblocks that writing brings and underestimating the threat. Mm-hmm. And it's just flipping around how we're looking at the roadblocks that are definitely going to be there for any writer.
Yeah, well, and it is kind of a journey, as where we're continuing or starting a writing practice. It's always just a journey from the day before.
Oh yeah, and the journey is going to have. It's kind of like, I think of it sometimes as going for a hike, and sometimes we have snags welded into the ground. We might trip here and there, but we still can enjoy the hike and keep going. And that's kind of how I look at the journey of writing is don't give up just because we trip here and there or there's a branch in our way or a log in our way. There's always a way over it or around it.
Well, and for our listeners that maybe are starting a writing practice with this new year, what inspiration would you like to give them? Because your book offers so much, and I know we've kind of covered a few things here, but what inspiration would you like to kind of give them as far as advice?
Well, the one thing that writers will hear over and over again is if you want to be a writer, you don't have to publish. I was talking with someone the other day, and she said, well, I write, but I'm not really a writer. And I said, why not? And she said, well, I never published anything. And I said, well, that's not the mark of a writer. A writer is someone who writes. And what my advice would be to write every day, even if it's 5 minutes. And if you're a teacher, you go to school and you teach. If you're a plumber, you go to work and you work on people's plumbing. So as a writer, again, it's developing the mindset that I don't have to be a published writer at this point. Maybe I will be. But all I have to do is write every day. And that's one of the things, not just the action of writing, but the mindset of calling yourself a writer and getting into some kind of habit or routine that allows you to write, because that's where, of course, reading along with that and the writing is what makes us good at our craft. But it's not just the craft, it's also how we think about ourselves. And that's really my point in the book, is how we frame our belief in ourselves and not let the self-doubt override that.
Well, you have such great inspiration in this book, and you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. When you were getting, just developing this book, because every day it's got such great insight, how long did it take for you to just do your research for this book or to do the writing for it?
Well, a lot of the research are things that I've learned. When hurdles were thrown at me. And some of it I was learning as I went. Actually, the way I got into this book was I was working on a novel, and I had writer's block. And I was in agony. For those who are listening who've had it, I'm sure they can identify with this. It's just a horrible feeling, and we tend to want to keep pushing and pushing. But the way I deal with writer's block, and I think it's the most effective way, is to step back. And so I wanted to keep my creative mojo going. So that's when I decided I'm going to step away from the novel, and I'm going to write a book that maybe can help other people. I wasn't sure where it was going to go, but that's what inspired me to write the daily meditation book. So I wrote about writer's block and self-doubt and how to surmount obstacles. And so some of it is based just on my own personal experiences as I'm going through it. And some of it's just based on some of the work that I do in mindfulness, the idea of being present in the moment and how we nurture ourselves. Mm-hmm. So it's about our mindset, but it's also about how we create a workstation and what we bring into that and how that can support our writing. Our writing tribe. It's an isolating experience to write. It's important to have support somewhere, and the best support in the world is having other people who write, who know what the pain and the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into it. So it came from some of the work I do with clients around, mindfulness and self-esteem and how you deal with the inner critic, and then some of it from my own personal experiences. And what each one of the daily meditations has a quote from a famous writer. And sometimes I would just find a really good quote and write a daily meditation from that quote, because there's so much wisdom among writers, the writing community.
Well, and I love your takeaways with each one. So, I had actually marked a couple for us to just kind of touch on. And, it's not a normal writing book, and it's so great because it gives you this perfect inspiration. You've got the quote, you've got the title. Like, I'm looking at Curb Your Perfectionism, and then it talks a little bit about it, and then you have today's takeaway. I mean, it's beautifully composed.
Oh, well, thank you. I like that format. I think it's the thing I like about the daily meditations is that little takeaway is just kind of a summary of the whole thing, so that we can kind of file it in the back of our mind, and as we go through our day, whether it's writing or taking care of the kids or whatever, we can kind of access it. And over time, when you have 20 or 30 of these, or maybe even 2 or 3 months, they all build on each other. And the people who've read some of these say that it changes their outlook immediately, almost filing that little idea away and kind of carry it into the experiences that life is going to bring. The other theme in this book is it's not how writing is treating us. It's not what happens with our writing that determines our future. It's what we do with it. And so I always think it's how are we treating our writing life? What do I do with a rejection from a publisher? What do I do if I have a book signing and nobody shows up? Which has happened to me and many well-known people that I know who are now writers. What do we do with that? Yeah, it is. Yeah,
that's a common thing because you're supposed to provide the crowd, and it's tough. It's tough to throw a party and then no one show up.
It sure is, and it can feel so self-defeating and humiliating. But when we remember that it's happened to the best, I have a friend, Alanis Morissette, is a friend of mine, and she's a singer-songwriter. Many people might remember her. She's still singing and composing. Every major Hollywood studio in Hollywood rejected her Jagged Little Pill. Once it came out, I mean, she won like every Grammy, a Grammy for almost every song on the album. And we hear people like J.K. Rowling had hundreds of rejections. Steve Barry, who's a incredible thriller writer, spent 12 years and 85 rejections before he got his first publication. So if anybody's listening who is doubting their ability or who are giving up, who want to give up, I just want to say it's just part of the deal. So let that strengthen you. Don't let it take you down. There's no reason to throw in the towel. Take the towel you want to throw in and wipe the sweat off your face and keep on going. That's that's great advice. My goodness. Yeah. I think of it, we're just traveling that path that everybody else has been on. It's not unique to us. And when we're isolated and we're writing and we feel the defeat, it feels like it's unique to us, but it really isn't. And when we're part of a community and we know it's happened to the most successful A-list writers that there are, it helps us keep going. We don't take it as personally.
It reminds me, I interviewed a New York Times bestselling author some time ago. It's probably been over a year or so. And she told me, she's like, my first book is a blockbuster bestseller. It was awesome. First book. And I was afraid to write because I thought nothing can be as good as that. And so it's interesting, these mind games that we kind of play with ourselves that kind of put us in some sort of paralysis in doing our writing.
That's right. I've heard a lot of highly successful writers talk about that, and there's a name for it. It's called the second book syndrome. Even some of the biggest names we know struggle with that even after they've had their third or fourth book, is can I live up to the challenge now, especially if it's been a big success. So these mind games stick with us. They don't go away just because we have a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. But the key is our ability to be able to deal with it. One of the things that I help people see is everybody has a critic. So I don't care who you are or what you do. And the critic is not us. It's a part of us. In psychology, we call it a subpersonality. So we don't fight it. We don't try to get rid of it. We just let it be there. And we can listen to it, but we don't have to believe what it says because most of the time it doesn't even tell us the truth. So that allowing it to be there and not fighting it actually brings a sense of peace. So that we can make our own decisions separate from the critic and what the critic is saying.
And that's usually so alive in everybody, regardless what kind of line of work they're in. That's why I found your book to be such a huge resource, because I could pick it up and just move. In fact, I had tagged ignore cutthroat critics is one of the ones I attacked.
Yeah.
And now that you were talking about this, and it's interesting because it doesn't matter if you're a writer, if you're an artist, if whatever kind of work you do that puts yourself out there, you'll hear these kind of things that pop up.
That's right, and that's where that rhino hide is so important. If we believe enough in ourselves, and if we've developed that, then we can keep our head above water. But again, somebody is not going to like what we do. It's just the nature of it. So it's important to really not listen to those people. And there are people out there who will cut things down because it's their job to criticize. And that doesn't mean that they're always right. I mean, we see that with film and Broadway plays, and as you say, in all the arts, we see that.
Yeah. When you're working with writers, because I know you do workshops as well, like what's one of the number one things that you see that writers have difficulty with, other than some of the stuff we've been chatting about?
Well, I think the number one thing is believing in ourselves and dealing with self-doubt. And, the idea of negativity, one of the things we know about, we tend to buy, if somebody criticizes our work, let's say we're a debut writer, then we're likely to take that as fact, as opposed to believing, well, that's just that person's opinion. Maybe there's something there I can take and use. But it's how to deal with a rejection letter or a critical review without bawling. And that takes some time. It takes actually, again, back to the science, it takes 3 positive events to offset 1 negative event. And that's because of that negativity bias that I mentioned before. But a lot of it, again, has to do with how we're looking at it. If I look at a negative review as how that can work for me, then that changes everything, and use it to reach the goals, my writing goals.
Well, and most people don't, think of a negative review as something that would help their writing goals.
Right, and that's the whole thing is, the growth mindset is using negativity as fuel to get where you want to go instead of letting it take you down. And here's the other thing that happens. When we get a negative review, sometimes we turn on ourselves. We don't even realize we do it. But we'll get a negative view, and then we will say things like, what an idiot I am. I should have never thought I could do that, or never thought. And that's one of the biggest, that's like adding insult to injury. It's one of the biggest obstacles. The obstacle then becomes not the negative review. It becomes us not supporting ourselves. So the whole idea of self-compassion, which I also write about, and there's research on this now, if something happens and if I'm defeated or if I'm rejected or if I'm hurt, and then I join with whoever that is that's done the rejection or the hurt, then there's nobody supporting me. The self-compassion, and we know this to be true, is if I have a rejection or defeat and I have compassion for myself and talk myself off the ledge and say, okay, so they didn't take my manuscript, or they said I should go back and sell burgers at McDonald's. But if I stay with compassion, it helps me get back in the saddle of writing. But if I join with the critics and condemn myself, then it's going to feel like a lost cause for sure. We call that the first and second dart. The first dart is what happens to us, and that's not what causes the suffering. It's the second dart that we throw at ourselves. So if I condemn myself or join in with the people who have hurt me or rejected me, then clearly I'm not going to be able to surmount and stay in the writing game. But if I can bring self-compassion to it, it lifts me up and helps me believe in myself so that I can keep going.
And then you can tell all those critics to move on over and make room for the one that's going to say yes.
That's right.
Yeah, and when you were developing your book, was there one of the daily writing practices and meditations that really kind of stuck with you?
Oh, there's so many.
I know. I mean, because I'm going through here, and I've got this book really tagged. I mean, there's a lot that I really enjoyed. And you talk about gratitude, and tell yourself you're a rewriter. I mean, you've got a lot in here.
And you're right, and those are both good ones right there. The whole idea of gratitude is one of those ways in which we can put on what I call the wide-angle lens, and I have a writing on that too in one of the daily meditations. Whenever we feel disappointment or discouragement, what happens is our mind goes into the zoom lens, like a zoom lens of a camera, and it clouds out everything else. And so it makes us feel bad, obviously. But one of the things we can all do is, in that moment, put on what we call the wide-angle lens of a camera. Take that negative event, put it in the context of a wide lens, and then look at all the things you're grateful for. And that could be my health, my family, my kids, the fact that, I was able to get to write this manuscript even though maybe it wasn't accepted yet. And when you do that, it lifts your emotions. It gives you the motivation and the mojo to get back into writing. So that wide-angle lens versus the zoom lens is really, really important for all of us in life, because life's going to throw us curveballs. I mean, that's the nature of life. That's what it is. It's not personal. Things happen to all of us. We all have our struggles. But the key is what we do with it, again. And that wide-angle lens can remind us is that there's much more to the big picture than just that one event.
Well, your book really offers, just not for writers, a great way for moving, forward, but just in everyday life, how we can, just have a better experience and be better people.
That's right. And you could probably go through and change writing to accounting or teaching or plumbing, or it could be, or just life. They're all just different ways of being able to live life to the fullest, really. A lot of us are living at a survival level, and just dealing with negativity and hurt and fear and so forth. And so what this really does is helps us elevate that a little bit more into not just enduring, but living fully. And that's, I think, probably one way to summarize the whole book is living fully as a person or as a writer or whatever our endeavor is.
I like how you put that, because it really kind of makes it more of a personal journey approach as opposed to listing something as good or bad. It's kind of just, trying to not so much be a better person, but just to have more of a full experience, as you're saying.
Right. And sometimes it's those what we think are negative experiences that actually teach us and that we can learn from, that can make us better or greater. And we forget that sometimes. But that's why I like the idea of, if it feels defeating, what can I do with it? How can I surmount it? How can I make it work for me? What can I learn from it? And that's what helps. That's one of the things you see this in any field of endeavor. You see it with Billie Jean King in tennis. You see it with Meryl Streep in acting. You see it with Michael Phelps in swimming. All these people have a winning frame of mind, and they don't give up. I mean, they've all had failures, but they take it and they ask, how will this work for me? How can I use this as fuel?
You kind of use that to learn and readjust and keep going.
Yeah, and to get stronger. I love the metaphor that grass grows through concrete. If you think about that, grass grows through concrete. That's powerful. I mean, grass, concrete, but it does. And there are probably a lot of other metaphors like that. All of us have within us something that scientists call a resilient zone. And what that means is we have that inside of us. We don't always know it, but when we have defeat, it helps us realize it sometimes. In physical endurance, I lift weights, and I've been able to lift I'm able to bench press my weight. And I didn't get there in one day. And my personal trainer, when I'm trying to lift 180 pounds and my muscles are shaking, she will say, "That's the tremor of truth." And I thought, wow, we have that in writing too, but we have to just keep on pushing and pushing and pushing and never give up. And then there's that final push, and there's success at the end if we keep going.
Well,
and the other thing is,
yeah, those truths are so relatable with everything, you know?
Yeah, and the other thing that takes us back to basics is when all is said and done, don't let us forget why we're writing to begin with. And for most of us, it's our love for writing. Mm-hmm. And when I remember that, I just feel my heart settle, you know, no matter if nobody shows up at a reading or if I get a rejection or a bad review or whatever it is, when I just keep connecting with my love for writing, that'll get us all through.
Yeah, to move you beyond, because it's bigger than any of those obstacles that you'll overcome.
That's right. And it strengthens us when we make that connection.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness, Dr. Bryan. I mean, we can talk all day. You're just a wealth of inspiration, and I just actually really adored your book. Where can our listeners of course, my goodness. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
Well, my website is www.bryan-robinsonbooks.com, and that's Bryan, BRYAN, ROBINSON. And on the website, it has some of the books that I've written and some of the things that I'm going to be doing in the future. So that's the best place.
And I know that you also have some articles on Psychology Today that I thought were quite profound.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. I'm writing a series of articles for Psychology Today, and they're putting up one a month. Some about, time, famine was one of the last one, which is a common thing we're all dealing with nowadays, which means there's not enough time, and that's what we call time famine. But there really is enough time, and that's what the article is about. It's about the sweetness of doing nothing and how important that is to bring the balance to this idea that we don't have enough time.
Mm-hmm. And you even have a couple other great ones. We'll have to check it out on your website, dealing with anger.
Yes.
And also state of mind. It's very colorful and very entertaining. It really has a great message. So you definitely want everyone to go check that out at marianne-robinsonbooks.com. Dr. Bryan, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, you're so welcome, Marianne. I appreciate the invitation, and I've really enjoyed it.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.